You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
I want to introduce a tradition here for this podcast and all future podcasts, wherein I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. They are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to the elders, past and present. Knowing the stories of the Aboriginal people will always be written in this landscape. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. So I hope you found the last couple of podcasts interesting, useful, thought-provoking, and I thought, given that in the last one I touched on the issue about loneliness, being alone, and solitude, I wanted to take it further into the realm of, really understanding the issue about wellness in ourselves. I've talked quite a bit about the various elements that we need to consider wherein we emerge feeling well. But, there's also a process of healing. It's a journey from where we begin to establish a relationship with ourselves that's safe and secure and wherein we can be satisfied. And we call that state fundamentally self-acceptance. Now, in the current sort of social media sphere and self-help, psychology and so on, there are a number of concepts that are thrown around in a way a little bit loosely, and I sort of want to put a bit of structure to that. I was talking to someone recently about the idea of, gratitude, empathy, compassion, and how these operate in our relationships. And my question of them was, well, do you ever ask yourself how they operate in your relationship with yourself? And they looked a little bit surprised. And my comment was that, well, we can develop self-compassion and gratitude for self, but ultimately, isn't it about moving away from these things that are fundamentally binaries? I'm either well or not, I'm grateful or not, but move into a place where we can appreciate ourselves as a whole. Okay, and so I want to lay out a little bit of a broad brush with a little bit of a deep dive into how can we really foster, feeling safe and secure in our relationship with ourselves, where we don't experience loneliness, where we are not experiencing anxiety. We might experience apprehension, but not deep-rooted, pervasive anxiety, and where we do not become depressed, wherein I feel hopeless and helpless, and where, intellectually my evaluation of myself is negative, and where my evaluation of the world is negative, and where my evaluation of the future is negative. Okay, those things feed into that process of helplessness and hopelessness. So self-efficacy becomes really, really important. And so one of the first things that I want to really put forward is that if we keep waiting to feel good in order to function well in the world, we could be actually waiting for a long time. Much of what I need to do rests in action and not in emotion. Emotion is a consequence frequently. And so, in my sphere of work, one of the big issues is about this thing. What's it mean being male, being manly, being masculine? One of the things that I deal with on a daily basis with a lot of the boys and men is this dichotomy about what they understand manliness or masculinity to be, and what is it that, when we're not that, and to put it crudely, does it matter whether I'm standing up to urinate or whether I'm sitting down? You might laugh at that, but, for some people, the idea is a man to sit down and urinate is abhorrent. It's not manly, right? So I'm not being flippant. I'm actually being very serious about a very fundamental human behavior. Are these things about being male, manly, and masculine all the same thing, or are there differences here? Now, for those of you who are women, I want you to think about this as well, because the issue of femininity is in a similar sense. What's feminine, what's not feminine. And we go into this process of hypermasculinity and hyperfemininity. And within that, there is a very important process that begins to take shape. And that is we start to compare ourselves to others. In my experience, that's often fraught with significant danger. It's a bit like getting stuck in quicksand. And so, if I come back to the process of, masculinity, and it is a process, it's not just a state of being. I'm not the same man as I was 10 years ago. I'm a different man, but I'm still a man in my book. And I don't really care too much about how someone else would define me as a man. I'm more interested in my relationship to myself and how I define this. But then, for me, also, the issue is I'm more interested in being a human being, well-rounded. Why? Because that takes away from this dualism, i.e. whether I'm manly enough, or I'm a good man or a bad man, or how I compare to women, and, all those sort of complexities that, in fact, are driving people insane, irrational. And it's all ultimately sort of fairly subjective. And so, how do we deal with this effectively? And one of the questions that often comes up is that if the consequences of these fragmentations in ourselves result in tension, which means anxiety and then possibly depression, is medication really the answer to this? We've got this explosion of adults now going on to ADD, ADHD medication. And, I'm very clear, and I can go into this in a lot more depth, but there is no such thing as mental illness. There is psychological distress and there are psychological disorders, but mental and illness don't go hand in hand. It can be neurological, physiological, hormonal illnesses that lead to mental, psychological disturbance. Right, so I know I might be cherry picking here, but that's the best way that we can look at that, and that's how we should look at it. All the biological reductionist treatments in psychology have not worked well, even though we call them psychiatry. So, what are some good ways of thinking about it? Well, in my book, a lot of the work that we need to do rests in philosophy that lends itself to psychology. And there are two particular philosophies that I think are important to consider in this process. The first one is Stoicism. And the other one, and this is from personal experience, is that when I take away the religiosity of Buddhism, especially Zen lends itself exceptionally well to being present in the moment and to accept myself and the world as it is. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have aspirations, because ultimately in Buddhism, it is all about aspiration. The aspiration to, bodhisattva, the enlightenment, the journey towards the Buddha. Now, there's also a neat little saying, which is when you find the Buddha in the middle of the road, kill him, because we can get too strung up by where we're going but not where we are. And so in Buddhism in particular, this whole idea of non-dualism argues against the multiplicity of stuff by stating that things appear distinct, but they're not separate. In an article, there's that I read by a guy called David H. He mentions that we live in a very dualistic-minded society. We're as opposed to living with what is. Right? So, in the whole field of masculinity, there is this what's masculine, what's not masculine. And to me, in a way, that's a nonsense argument. It's misleading, it's irrational. It lacks a sense of objectivity. The dualism comes out in all sorts of different ways. Am I fat? Am I skinny? Am I lazy? Am I active? Am I successful? Unsuccessful? And I argue very strongly that dualism, that binary thinking, is very much a patriarchal artifact. The hierarchy, the territoriality, one thing or another, is just part of that value system that really puts us at odds with our humanity. So, one of the burning questions that often comes up in this situation is, so you're promoting, the idea of becoming self-accepting. Does that mean that I don't need to change? No, that doesn't mean that at all. As I said, if I adopt a Buddhist idea, it's about moving towards a higher state of being. If I look at it from a Gestalt perspective, it's learning and moving towards integrating myself as a whole, more than existing in this tension of, polarities and fragments of my personality. Now, interestingly enough, in a somewhat different way, Stoicism takes a similar approach. And I did find an article by a guy called Caleb Ontiferos, which he titled The Four Pillars of Stoicism. And I thought that was quite interesting because, they're the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism. I thought, okay, this looks really interesting. Now, in his article, he talked about several things: acceptance, awareness, and the idea of action and anti-fragility. So if I address the last one as simply being, okay, more resilient, we're going to get a lot of traction with that. Okay, so how do I work towards self-acceptance? And the first thing is, and this is my view, not Caleb's, is that rather than moving straight into acceptance, I firstly need to practice awareness. Awareness is a central element. It's, understanding my defenses, my resistances against awareness, and the insights, the illuminations that come from that. I also need to begin to practice acceptance. We get stuck with this idea that I'm not good enough the way that I am, rather than going, accept yourself as you are. Doesn't mean being fine with your imperfections. It means accepting yourself just as you are. Right? Warts and all, okay? And there's no, hedging your bets with it. There's no, bargaining with yourself. And so it's really, really important that even when I'm miserable, that I accept my miserable self, because that's going to change. Remember, emotions are temporary. Actions, the right actions carried out regularly, create better emotions. The right actions, okay? So, I can say that when you're miserable, don't wish for a happy self. And if you're happy, don't worry about being miserable. One of the things that I have to deal with a lot of people is this thing called symptom anxiety. They get anxious about being anxious, or they get anxious about being angry, anxious about being depressed, or alternatively depressed being about anxious, or depressed about being angry. So we need to let this go. And that leads us to feeling more accepting of myself. And what that leads to is being able to trust myself more. If I can trust myself to deal with negative thoughts, negative feelings, and negative behaviours, then I've got a really firm foundation. But most of us keep getting stuck either in the past or in the future. Well, I've never been able to do this. Well, that doesn't tell me anything about the now. Certainly doesn't tell me anything about the future. So it's important to recognize that self-acceptance is not a compromise. It is a realization, a recognition. And when you actually see just what you are, the chances are that you are going to feel more energized, more invigorated. But you've got to be aware of those glasses that create a confirmation bias, which is if you're negative about yourself, then if you've got those glasses on, you're not going to see yourself as who you truly are. The essence of you. Remember also to separate out who you are from what you do. They don't necessarily, mean the same thing. I can be a very good person and occasionally do some bad things. Now, that could be on a spectrum. As a good person, I'm not likely to, blow up a bank or rob a bank, but I might be nasty to my neighbour because they've pissed me off about something. And then later on, I'll regret it and I will try to make amends. So the important aspect is creating actions in relationship to yourself that are affirming, that are acknowledging, that are validating, that allow you to begin to reflect and allow you to choose better behavior from which you will then feel better. And that is a big step towards anti-fragility, or what we more commonly refer to as resilience. Resilience is the buzzword. Okay, so let me tie this together. So if we're going to make things actionable, then my awareness and my actions need to be in regard to my body, my thoughts, my emotional state, and my social being. How am I connecting to others? And so they're built into this. There are very concrete and clear steps that we can engage with that is going to lead to me being self-accepting. It is going to increase, improve, and heal my attachment to myself, from which I will feel safe and secure. And when that process is going on, I can take a step back and enjoy the sense of satisfaction. I may not be happy right in that instance, but I can be satisfied that when the shit's going down, I'm on top of it to some degree. There's always a margin of error. And on that note, I hope that gives you some practical sense. And if you would like, I will really put together a podcast that goes even more into details than this. So go out, before you change the world, think about changing yourself, because that will become an inspiration to others without even telling them. Until next time, this is me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.